back in 2021, I called Melbourne one of the worst markets in all of Australia to invest in property. And not just for that time, but for the foreseeable future as well. But now, almost everywhere I look, I see people going on about the Melbourne property boom. So, was I wrong? Is the Melbourne market really about to boom? Or are many people about to make one of the worst financial decisions of their lives? I'll reveal the answers to all of that and more in just a second. But if you're new here, hi, my name's Niro, and I've been investing in property now for 23 years all around Australia. And over the last 9 years, I've helped over 500 people buy the right investment properties. And in this episode, I'll show you why some people are about to make some major gains by buying in Melbourne in the coming years, while others, buying in Melbourne, it could be one of their worst decisions, an absolute nightmare. And the 5 checks you need to do before you buy in Melbourne. So many people seem to think that you can just buy anywhere in Melbourne and make money, but that's actually not the case. You see, Melbourne in many ways is actually more spread out than Sydney. So that means some corridors will rise, others will just stay flat, potentially even fall. So if you buy in the wrong pocket, you could be waiting years for growth. Melbourne's diversity means you must target suburbs and local government areas carefully. Broad Melbourne stats don't mean anything, and they certainly don't protect you. For example, if you look at Cotality's latest data, as I record this, Melbourne is actually one of the worst performing markets right now. In fact, it's actually got the poorest growth of all our capital cities, apart from poor Hobart. Yet suburbs like Frankston in Melbourne have actually been some of our fastest growing markets in the entire country. Now, consider this. If a suburb like Frankston has been one of the top performing suburbs in Australia, and yet Melbourne overall is our second worst capital city for growth right now, what does that tell you? It tells you you need to, like I said earlier, drill down to a suburb level or at least a local council area level. You can't just either target or ignore Melbourne based on what you're seeing in the mainstream media. And when you drill down into the different areas of Melbourne, you need to check who's buying and why, because that will make a big difference to your success. But to understand who's buying and why, we need to look at what is actually driving demand right now. So if you are an investor who's seriously considering where to buy your next investment property, we go into a lot more detail on the best places to buy and the ones you should absolutely avoid based on your personal goals during our free strategy call. You can book now by clicking the link in the description below or scanning the QR code on your screen. For now though, let's see exactly who's buying where in Melbourne. And that brings us to the 5 checks you need to do before buying in Melbourne. Number 1, look at what or who is driving demand. You see, it's not uncommon for people to think, oh, Melbourne's population is growing, so that will make prices rise. Now, it's true. Melbourne's population is growing right now. In fact, its rate of population growth is one of the fastest in the country. But that's been the case now for years. And yet, from 2021 until really this year, prices in most areas around Melbourne either went flat or backwards. So what does that tell you? It tells you that a growing population does not necessarily mean prices will rise. This is one of the most common mistakes I see so many people make. A growing population is not enough proof that a market will rise in value. So then, what should you look at instead? You want to look at where owner-occupiers are buying. Where is the demand from people who want to buy in that area greater than the supply of properties? That is the key data point you need to consider, because it is those areas that will rise in value. So focus on areas where owner-occupiers are buying. Consider things like schools, jobs, transport nodes, and a big thing, socio-economic status. Please don't just buy in an area because it's cheap. If people living in that area can't afford property at their current prices, and if it's not an area that's attracting people to want to move into the area and migrate into the area so they can live there, then it's unlikely for that area to grow in value long term. And even if it does grow in the short term, chances are over the long term, price growth will stagnate and you'll probably attract the wrong type of tenant. So ignore the hype of what you're seeing online. For example, this might be controversial. A suburb like Broadmeadows, that's a suburb I would not touch in Melbourne. The locals living there just don't have the income to afford property prices to rise. Now that is not a judgment call. It's a data call. And Broadmeadows also is not a suburb that most people aspire to want to move to from outside the area. So then why are so many investors targeting Broadmeadows as a suburb? Well, this is where so many investors make their first mistake, chasing the wrong type of buyer demand. It's one of the biggest points I mention in so much of my content because I see so many investors get this wrong. They buy in investor hotspots. And if you get this wrong in Melbourne, it will hurt you for sure. You see, parts of Melbourne right now are being primarily bought up by investors. Like I said, investor hotspots, if you will. Now, you might be wondering, okay, Niro, what's the problem with that? Well, first of all, if the majority of people buying in an area are all investors, then they're competing for the limited pool of tenants. And if you buy in an area where there are too many investors and not enough tenants, you're going to struggle to get your property rented. It's going to take you longer to find a tenant than you want, and you'll find that rents aren't going to rise that much. Take Beveridge as a suburb, for example. You can buy freestanding houses here in this suburb for under $700,000. Many investors say, hey, that's cheap. That must make it a good deal. Well, for me, you couldn't pay me enough to buy an investment property there right now. Why? Because the vacancy rate, as I record this, is a whopping 16.8%. That means roughly 1 in every 6 properties is sitting there vacant right now. There are other reasons as well why I wouldn't buy in Beveridge. I'll share some of that a bit later on. But even putting all that aside, that kind of vacancy, 16.8%, forget it. It's just too high, especially when you consider that Melbourne as a whole only has a vacancy rate of 1.8%, which is really low. So that means Beveridge has a vacancy rate that is over 9 times higher than Melbourne's vacancy. No matter how much you like this area or how much you fall in love with a property that you think might be a good investment in Beveridge, the odds are you will struggle to get your property rented because there are just too many investors who've bought there for that particular suburb. That's why I always say focus on areas where there's strong owner-occupier demand. Instead of focusing on investor hotspots, focus on what I like to call owner-occupier hotspots. Focus on suburbs where owner-occupiers dominate, because if most people buying a property in an area are owner-occupiers, then the available pool of properties to rent actually shrinks. It remains low. That keeps the vacancy rate low, rental demand high, and that is what you want. So before you even think about buying in Melbourne, you need to know if the numbers and the data all stack up. That's why I created a free property checklist. It's the exact process my team and I use to stress test a suburb for growth, vacancy, and most importantly, risk. Make sure you grab it from the link in the description below or by scanning the QR code on the screen before you find yourself with an investment you regret. Number 3, make sure you understand the local dynamics of the suburb you're buying in. I see so many investors right now, especially many who live in Sydney, thinking they should buy a property in Melbourne that's close to a train line. Their logic is, well, that would make it easier for people to commute to work, just like it does in Sydney. So then, what's the problem with that? Sounds logical, right? Well, have you considered what if people who live in that particular area don't want to be able to walk to a train station? What if they mainly drive and they only use the train intermittently? For instance, there's a couple of suburbs we're targeting right now in the southeast of Melbourne, and we know from speaking to the locals in the area. Yes, as buyer's agents, we actually visit the areas we're targeting and we speak to the locals about what they like and what they don't like. This kind of information, it's priceless for our clients because it gives them insights that no online tool or information source online can provide. That's how you identify the best pockets to target in an area, and in some cases, which pockets to avoid. And we know from speaking to the locals in these suburbs that they don't want to be walking distance to the train line. There are issues with noise and also, let's just say, some unsavory characters, especially in the evening and at nighttime. So they want to be a little bit away from the train line, close enough to drive and maybe park their cars, but not walking distance. Now, if you don't understand this quirk, you could easily end up buying a property, maybe even in a good suburb, but in the wrong pocket for that particular suburb, and then maybe end up getting the wrong types of tenants or compromising on your capital growth. So make sure you understand the dynamics of the suburb you're targeting and make sure you're focusing on buying close to the right amenities that local owner-occupier buyers actually want. You don't want to get this part of your due diligence wrong. Now, beyond the location quirks of different suburbs in Melbourne, you also need to check if the numbers work, because in some parts of Melbourne, cash flow could become a serious issue for you. I've seen this happen too many times in my 23-year investing career. Investors buying because they hear prices are rising fast and they don't want to miss out. But they fail to consider the cash flow implications. You see, while Melbourne prices are indeed rising in some pockets, not everywhere, but some pockets, that does not mean that just because prices are rising there, every investor should buy, because Melbourne rental yields in general are amongst the lowest in the country. Yes, so even though Melbourne might be cheaper than, say, Brisbane or Sydney in terms of property prices, in certain areas of Melbourne, the rental return is so low that your cash flow ends up worse. Yes, buying a property that's cheaper could actually put you into a worse cash flow situation. Now, you might be thinking, well, yeah, but rents could rise in Melbourne. Yes, they could. But that rental increase will almost always be limited in Melbourne. Why? Because Melbourne has the highest concentration of units for any capital city in the country. Yes, even higher than Sydney. And eventually, if and when rents on houses get too high, tenants will simply choose to rent an apartment because of affordability. So that means that rental increases will always be capped based on just the dynamics of Melbourne. And over the last 2 decades plus that I've been investing, Melbourne has always had the lowest, or at least one of the lowest rental returns in the country. But it gets worse than that. Not only are the rental returns poorer than many other areas around Australia, but buying an investment property in Melbourne, or in fact anywhere in Victoria for that matter, incurs land tax from your very first property. So you have to have this extra expense. It's the only state in Australia where that happens. So look, I'm not saying now don't buy in Melbourne. What I am saying is do your numbers. Make sure you know your cash flow position before you buy and ensure that the property you buy is truly affordable for you. Because if it isn't, it could be an investment decision you regret. Now, even if your cash flow holds up, there's still one more check you need to do. And that's check number 5, look into future supply. I said this earlier, that most people seem to think that just because Melbourne has a growing population, and there's a lot of hype about Melbourne right now, especially online, that they can just buy any property they can afford and they're going to make money. Not true. Here's one piece of data that if you fail to check, it will kill your future growth. And that is future supply. You see, the Victorian state government is probably the most proactive right now in terms of trying to meet its housing targets, including even stripping councils of rezoning rights so the government can decide where to build more houses. Now, that might be a good thing for the housing crisis, but let's be real here. Do you think the government is going to be fair in its allocation of where properties are going to be built? Or is it likely to just build a glut of properties in areas where maybe it's just easier to build for whatever reason? I think you know the answer to that question, right? And that means you need to check future supply for properties in the area you're looking to buy in. Because if you, maybe without knowing, end up buying a property in a suburb where a glut of new properties are being built, your capital growth will be severely compromised. Why? Well, because capital growth just comes from one thing. When you really boil it down, it just comes down to one thing: demand from owner-occupiers being higher than supply. That's it. But on the flip side, if supply ends up higher than demand, property prices could go flat, or worse, they could even fall. And in some areas, the Victorian state government is planning on building massive numbers of properties. Allen government to release swathes of land for new homes on cities' fringe. The Allen government is set to release huge plots of land in the outer north, west and southeast to boost the number of homes as it attempts to fix the state's housing crisis. The government has identified 27 new greenfield areas where land will be released in coming years. The focus on Melbourne's booming growth areas comes after the government committed to building 30% of new homes in the outer suburbs, while the other 70% are squeezed into, the remaining suburbs. The commitment is understood to be the biggest rollout of new land for housing a government has ever made. So where are these suburbs? Well, let me give you just two examples. Number one, Rockbank, which has sky-high building approval rates. There are so many building approvals right now and so many house and land packages being built in Rockbank, there is no way I can recommend that as a great suburb to buy in. But how about this one? Beveridge, a suburb I mentioned earlier on. Again, building approval rate too high. Too many properties coming online in that suburb. So how do you find these suburbs? Well, here's one way not to do it. You do not use Google Maps as your primary research tool. You don't go on Google Maps and look at all the areas where there's vacant land and think they're all bad, because that means you're probably not going to end up buying anything in Melbourne. Okay? In some areas, yes, there might be vacant land there, but that land can either never be built on for whatever reason, or the amount of supply that could be built is so low relative to the amount of demand in that area that it will have almost zero impact on capital growth. So don't rely on Google Maps. Instead, check building approvals. Check if they're building lots of house and land packages in that suburb. For example, Rockbank I mentioned earlier on, there's lots of them there. And if they're building lots of house and land packages, it's time to turn around and run. That's if you're serious about making money through property. And that's why you're here, right? So don't focus on those types of suburbs. Instead, focus on established suburbs where there's tight supply. And look, if you can't afford to buy in those types of suburbs, don't just buy anywhere else in Melbourne. Instead, it could actually be better for you to buy outside of Melbourne. So hopefully you can see that while there is likely to be plenty of money made through property in Melbourne, if you buy in the right areas, you can easily end up regretting your investment decision if you buy in the wrong area. Now that you know what to look for when considering buying an investment property in Melbourne, that's great. Avoiding mistakes is one thing. Picking the right strategy and the right city, well, that's a whole other ballgame. So check out this video next where I show you everything you need to start investing in property, from setting your goals, structuring your finance, choosing the right suburbs that are actually going to compound safely over time, choosing the right property, all of that and more. Check that video out now. I'll see you there.